Hey everyone, and welcome to the video. Before we get started, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for the support, and now let us jump right in. They're in his room. Curtains drawn. Phone between them, glowing like a third presence. She shifts. Doing what? Jake shrugs, pretending not to care. But he does. You know, like trying it. Emily's voice comes out tight. No. Jake watches her. She doesn't meet his gaze. He turns back to the screen. Clicks a new video. Emily doesn't stop him. But that night, she dreams of drowning. In the dream, Jake holds the phone above the surface while she sinks. He doesn't notice. He's too busy watching. The next time she comes over, the air feels heavier. Jake seems impatient. Pacing. Half distracted. Emily sits stiffly on the couch, arms crossed. Jake drops beside her, phone already open. He doesn't ask if she wants to watch. He just starts playing it. Emily doesn't look. After a while, he pauses. You don't like this anymore? She shrugs. It's boring. Jake scoffs. You used to like it. I never said that. Silence. He stares at her. You're acting weird. She doesn't reply. He pushes play again. This time, she gets up. I have to go. Jake doesn't follow. He just watches the door as it closes. Then turns the volume up. Days pass. They don't text as much. When they do, it's brief. Mechanical. Jake keeps watching. He starts venturing deeper. Stranger links. Darker clips. His sleep gets shorter. His jokes sharper. His moods unpredictable. He deletes his photos. Stops drawing. Stops listening to music. Just videos. Always videos. Emily stays away for a while. Then one Friday she returns. Jake looks surprised. Not happy. Not angry. Just surprised. They sit in silence for a long time. Then she speaks. I don't want to watch that stuff anymore. Jake doesn't respond. She continues. It makes me feel sick. Like I'm being pulled into something I can't get out of. Jake blinks. His voice is soft. Almost absent. Then why'd you come back? Emily stares at the phone on the table. The lock screen shows their shared playlist. A forgotten song starts playing. Something innocent. Something warm. Something from before. Emily breathes in. I came back for you. Not the phone. Jake looks at her. Really looks. Then slowly he locks the screen. The glow vanishes. Just two kids. In silence. No noise. No filters. No masks. For the first time in weeks, Emily smiles. It's small, but real. Jake looks away. Embarrassed. Ashamed. Relieved. Maybe all three. The silence stretches. Then she whispers, let's go outside. Jake nods. And they do. But later that night, when the house is dark, and the silence grows too loud, Jake unlocks the phone. Just for a minute. Just one clip. Just to remember what it felt like. It didn't happen all at once. Shadows don't fall that way. Not in this kind of story. They stretch slowly across the floor, creeping in from the edges of bright rooms, slithering beneath door frames, waiting until you no longer remember what sunlight felt like. And that's how it began, for Jake and Emily. Not with a decision, but with a drift. The days grew quieter. The visits more frequent. And though neither of them said it aloud, the phone, the screen, the videos had become more than curiosity. It had become ritual. A secret altar in a house where no one prayed for them. Jake noticed it first. The way Emily began dressing. At first it was subtle. Tighter jeans. A shirt a size too small. Then a different kind of lip balm. A bit of shimmer. A curve in her posture that hadn't been there before. She caught him staring once. She didn't look away. Jake's heart pounded, but not with innocence. Not with fear either. With heat. A learned kind of hunger. Not instinctual. Inherited. Refined by the thousands of images they'd consumed together. Images burned into their retinas like aftershocks. Their jokes changed. Less about cartoons. More about bodies. Less about school. More about what people did behind closed doors. They'd laugh, but with a silence behind it. An ache. A dare. Emily started mimicking voices from the videos. Jake would raise an eyebrow. She'd smirk. He'd respond by mimicking a pose. They weren't pretending to be characters. They were trying on identities, like borrowed costumes. But the longer they wore them, the harder they were to take off. One afternoon, Emily asked a question. So casual, it was almost buried in the hum of background music. Do you ever think about actually doing it? Jake froze. For a moment, the world felt like it paused with him. The blinking cursor on his homework screen. The slow rotation of the ceiling fan. The pulse in his neck. He looked at her. Her face was unreadable. Like she'd already floated far beyond him. Like he was the one who needed catching up. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That week, their videos changed. No more quick clips. They searched for scenes that looked real. Not acted. Not staged. Ones that looked like people who knew each other. People who trusted each other. People who had history. Jake told himself it mattered. That if it was about connection, it wasn't wrong. But the truth was simpler. He wanted what he saw. He didn't care how it came. Emily started coming over earlier. She no longer waited for an invitation. Her bag had lip gloss, a brush, and a folded hoodie she never wore. She'd say she was studying. But they hadn't touched homework in days. Instead, they lay side by side, phone propped between them, eyes locked on a flickering screen. Hands close. Breath sinking. Sometimes their fingers touched. Neither of them moved away. The first imitation was unspoken. A lean in. A shift in body weight. A breath caught in the throat. Then contact. Not dramatic. Just lips brushing lips. Tentative. Fumbling. Silent. When they pulled apart, they didn't smile. Didn't laugh. They just pressed play again. As if the screen gave permission. As if real life only mattered when it reflected what they'd already seen. The next days blurred. Small touches. Longer stares. Heavier silences. They didn't talk about what they were becoming. They didn't even know how. There was no language for it. Only repetition. Only echo. Only mimicry. At school, Emily wore darker eyeliner. Jake walked with a slight swagger. Their friends noticed, but said nothing. Because change in teenagers is expected. Even when it's unnatural. Even when it reeks of something unspoken. They began to act it out. Scenes. Moments. Gestures they'd memorized. In Jake's room. In the garage. Once, behind the school during lunch. Always quick. Always hidden. Always followed by silence. And guilt. The kind of guilt that doesn't scream. The kind that sits in your chest like cold stones. But they never spoke of it. Because if they gave it a name, it might become real. Emily started crying at night. Quietly. Alone. The kind of crying where no tears fall, but your lungs still hurt. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. Not because she looked different, but because she'd forgotten who she was before. Before the phone. Before the videos. Before Jake started looking at her like that. Before she started liking it. Jake stopped drawing. He told himself it was because of exams. But the sketchpad stayed untouched. His dreams became warped. Even when he closed his eyes, the images didn't leave. They played behind his eyelids like ghosts. Smiling. Inviting. Demanding. One evening, they crossed a line. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just further than before. A breath too deep. A touch too long. A whisper that didn't belong to either of them, but to the characters they had become. Afterward, they sat in silence. The air between them felt like glass, ready to shatter. Emily stood. Jake didn't stop her. She left without a word. The phone buzzed once. He didn't check it. He already knew what it would say. That night, Emily locked her door. Deleted the app. Blocked the site. She cried again. This time with sound. But it wasn't regret. It was grief. Grief for herself. For the part of her that still believed in innocence. Jake stayed awake. Phone glowing beside him. He didn't watch anything. He just stared at the home screen. Felt the silence scream louder than any video ever had. Felt like he was sinking. Felt like the only thing real anymore was the void inside him. The next day, Emily didn't come over. Jake waited. Hours passed. He opened the window, listened to the wind, wondered if she'd ever look at him the same way again. Part of him hoped not. Part of him didn't care. What they didn't know, what neither of them could fully grasp, was that their routine hadn't just darkened. It had shifted them, bent their view of love, twisted their definition of intimacy, blurred the lines between want and need, between performance and reality, between them and the images they consumed. In a world where love was assumed but rarely shown, Jake and Emily were left to find meaning in shadows. And now those shadows had hands, and names, and cravings, and scars. They were still young, still searching, still hoping someone would notice. Someone would reach in, turn off the screen, and say, "You don't have to be this. You are still allowed to be whole." But for now, they only had each other, and the silence, and the guilt, and the stories they no longer knew how to tell. It was a Friday, the kind of day that slips through the cracks of memory, not for what it was, but for what it became. Cloudless, still, undisturbed. The air was thick with that deceptive calm, the kind that often precedes irreversible choices. Both mothers were gone. Mrs. Carter had a late-night financial review in the city. Mrs. Miller had accepted a weekend stall at a trade fair 2 towns over. 2 households, 2 exhausted women, 2 teenagers left alone. Again. But this time, the silence wasn't just familiar, it was charged. Like a storm humming just beyond the window pane. Jake's house felt bigger than usual. Echoing. Empty. The walls watched. Even the fridge hummed a little louder, like it knew something was about to happen. Jake sat on the couch, phone in hand, thumbs twitching. His heartbeat wasn't fast, but it was aware. Every sound, every second, felt like it was moving toward something. He didn't know what. Not really. But he hoped. And hope can be dangerous in unlit rooms. Emily arrived at 7:12 p.m. She didn't knock. She never did anymore. Her hair was wet at the ends, rushed from the shower, maybe. Or maybe not. Maybe she hadn't wanted to look too composed. Maybe she'd wanted to look effortless. Or maybe she hadn't thought about it at all. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. It wasn't like before, when they'd huddle over the phone, stifling laughter, debating which actor was weird or which scene was fake. Tonight, there was no laughter. No debate. Only intention, unspoken but loud. They went upstairs. Jake's room looked like it always did. Unmade bed. Open window. A single lamp illuminating dust in the air. The kind of dust that dances in circles, unaware it's floating in something broken. Emily sat on the edge of the bed. Jake sat beside her. There was a silence that pressed on their skin, suffocating and soft. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Their eyes met. Not searching. Not asking. Just meeting, like 2 travelers in a foreign country pretending they spoke the language. The kiss was automatic. Mechanical. They'd done this before. Dozens of times. But tonight it was different. Because tonight, the line between imitation and action was crossed not with hesitation, but with gravity. And once that gravity pulls you in, it's almost impossible to stop. Clothes moved. Fingers stumbled. Breathing changed. But it wasn't passion. Not really. It was confusion dressed up as intimacy. A choreography stolen from strangers behind a screen. Jake's hands trembled barely. Emily's eyes stayed open. Not because she wanted to see, but because she was afraid to close them. Afraid that if she did, she might disappear. And then it happened. Not violently. Not theatrically. But clumsily. Uncomfortably. A moment that should have been halted 100 times before, but wasn't. Not because they were evil. Not because they were ready. But because they didn't know what ready even meant. Because no one had ever told them. Because the internet had. And the internet doesn't ask if you're okay. When it was over, Jake rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel like a man. He felt blank, like a book someone had written on, then torn all the pages out of. Emily sat upright, gathered her clothes in silence. Her skin prickled. The room felt too warm, too cold, too visible. Jake turned his head toward her. He said her name, softly, but it didn't land. It was like calling out to someone already on the other side of a river. Emily didn't cry, not yet. She stood, pulled on her hoodie, didn't look in the mirror, didn't look at him. Just walked down the stairs with footsteps that sounded like echoes from a dream you want to forget. The front door clicked softly behind her. Jake didn't move. The silence grew fangs. The room smelled different now, like sweat and sorrow and something else, something unspoken. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, all he could see was her face. Not the one from 5 minutes ago, but the one from before. The one with the cartoons, the giggles, the wide, curious eyes. And he realized he'd never see that version of her again. Emily ran the moment she hit the pavement. She didn't know why, just that her legs needed to move. Her chest hurt, her vision blurred. By the time she reached her front door, her hands were shaking so violently she dropped her keys twice. When the lock finally turned, she rushed in, slammed the door, and leaned against it, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Her bedroom was dark. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't take off her shoes. She crawled into bed fully clothed, wrapped herself in a blanket, and curled into herself like a secret too fragile to be spoken. Then the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, but relentless. Each one carving its way down her cheek like a memory that refused to stay buried. She didn't sleep. Not really. She drifted in and out of a half-nightmare, half-memory trance. She remembered Jake's voice, the weight of the silence afterward, the coldness of the room, the way her stomach twisted, not with pain but with wrongness. A wrongness she couldn't describe. A wrongness no filter could erase. She didn't go to school the next day, nor the day after. She ignored Jake's texts, didn't open his voice notes, didn't even look at the phone. It sat face down on her dresser, like a criminal. And maybe they both were. Her mother noticed. The silence, the locked door, the skipped meals. But Mrs. Miller was too tired, too overworked, too distracted to push. She chalked it up to teenage mood swings. She'll be fine, she muttered to herself as she packed yams into a sack. She always is. But she was wrong. Because some nights don't pass. Some nights stay curled up inside you. Waiting. Whispering. Wounding. Jake walked past Emily's house on the second day. He hoped to catch a glimpse. A curtain twitching. A shadow. Something. But there was nothing. Just stillness. Just absence. And he began to understand something. Something terrible. It wasn't just that he'd hurt her. It was that he didn't know how. He didn't have the tools. The words. The heart. He only had the phone. And the silence. And a version of himself he wasn't sure he could ever unbecome. Some stories don't announce their turning points. They sneak in, like rot under floorboards. You don't notice until you step through. Until everything breaks. And then you realize, it wasn't a night. It was the night. The one that splits the story in two. Before and after. And no amount of pretending can stitch it back together. Monday arrived like a slow exhale, unwanted but inevitable. The sky was gray, not with drama but with fatigue. The kind of gray that made the world look faded, like someone had drawn it in pencil and forgotten to color it in. The school gates were loud with backpacks slamming into lockers, sneakers screeching against tile floors, laughter that was too loud to be genuine. And there, moving through it all like someone underwater, was Jake. His steps were slow, not from fear but from weight. The kind of weight that wraps around your chest and makes every breath a negotiation. His backpack hung low, his shoulders lower. And when he spotted Emily by her locker, something inside him curled, tight, sharp, familiar. She was there, physically present, but behind a wall now. A wall she didn't build with bricks or locks or words, but with silence. And silence, when wrapped in pain, can be louder than anything. He walked toward her. Every step felt rehearsed and wrong. She didn't look up at first. She was shuffling books, an act she repeated twice, maybe 3 times, though nothing changed. When he stopped beside her, the air trembled. "Emily," he said, and the word hung between them like a fragile thread. She glanced at him, not with hatred, not even with anger, but with a tiredness far too old for a 16-year-old girl. "I'm sorry," he whispered. 3 syllables, not enough to undo anything, but sometimes a wound needs acknowledgement before it can breathe. She didn't answer right away. A pause dragged between them like the silence before a storm. Finally, she said, "Okay," but her voice was flat. Not accepting, not forgiving, just acknowledging. A nod in the dark. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. The hallway continued moving around them, as if the world hadn't just cracked and shifted beneath their feet. They walked to class together, but not side by side. There was space between them now. A space filled with ghosts of laughter, fingerprints on a screen, a silence that used to feel comfortable, but now echoed with memories neither wanted to remember. That week they tried. They studied together again, played games half-heartedly, laughed at jokes that didn't land. They spoke like strangers wearing familiar voices. Sometimes they'd glance at each other too long, then look away too fast. Jake noticed she no longer leaned into him when she laughed. Emily noticed he no longer smiled with his eyes. Everything they did was laced with memory, like invisible ink only visible under guilt. They both pretended not to see it. At lunch, Jake picked at his food. Emily stared at hers. Around them, life moved forward. Friends gossiped. Teachers shouted. Bells rang. But inside, both teens were stuck on pause. It wasn't that they didn't want to move on. It was that they didn't know how. The innocence that had once colored their friendship was gone, and in its place was something they didn't ask for, something too heavy for hands still learning how to hold. One afternoon, as the sun bled through the classroom blinds, Jake turned to her. "Do you hate me?" he asked, voice barely audible. She blinked. Thought. Then said, "No. But sometimes I wish we hadn't." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Jake nodded, lips pressed together, a quiet acceptance of a truth they both carried. The whispers around her were just that, whispers, but Emily felt as though everyone could see through her. Her friend, Miriam, noticed first. "You look pale," she said. "Like actually sick." Emily laughed it off, a laugh that sounded too hollow, too rehearsed. But Miriam didn't drop it. She leaned in, eyes narrowed, voice hushed. "Did something happen? Like, that kind of something?" And that's when it crashed into her like a tidal wave. The possibility she had been too afraid to name. The dots connected themselves in the dark corners of her mind, without her permission. That afternoon, she left school early. Said she had a headache. But it wasn't her head that hurt. It was the churning spiral of maybe growing louder and louder until it became a scream. She took the test alone. The bathroom light flickered overhead like it was afraid of what it would reveal. Her fingers shook as she opened the box. The stick felt heavier than it should have. She waited. 60 seconds that stretched into forever. Her heart pounded in her ears like footsteps approaching. And then it appeared. 1 line. Then 2. No hesitation. No mercy. Positive. The word wasn't even spoken. It just lived there, burning behind her eyes, blooming in her chest like a secret too wild to tame. Emily dropped the test on the bathroom floor, backed into the wall, and slid down until her knees hit the tile. Her breathing was short, sharp. She wanted to cry, but nothing came. She wanted to scream, but the silence swallowed her whole. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, same face, same eyes, but something was gone. Something was different. A shift had occurred. Childhood had officially ended, not with a ceremony, but with a pink plastic confirmation in her hand. The walk to Jake's house felt like walking through fog. Her feet moved, but everything else felt suspended. The sun was out, but nothing looked bright. At his door, she didn't knock. She just texted, "I need to talk." He opened within seconds, his face lifting with that familiar hope, a smile that vanished the moment he saw hers. They sat in his room. Not close. Not far. Just enough space for a truth to exist between them. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her. She told him, not with drama, not with theatrics, just the raw, plain, irreversible truth. Jake went still. For a second, he didn't blink. It was as if someone had unplugged the part of him that knew how to breathe. And then his face shifted, faster than she expected. Fear. Not the protective kind. Not the brave kind. But the selfish, cornered kind. We need to get rid of it, he said. The words were ice. Sharp. Final. No one can know. No one can find out. No one can ever find out. And there it was, laid bare in the open. Not just the secret, but the fear it carried. The panic it planted in their bones. They weren't just kids anymore. They weren't just guilty. Now, they were bound by something far more real. Far more permanent. The weight of consequence had arrived, wearing the mask of a child not yet born. Emily didn't respond right away. Her mind was a thunderstorm. Her pulse a drumbeat. Her body was no longer her own. Her future had been rewritten in a single night. And Jake's words, though spoken in panic, felt like chains. He paced the room, running hands through his hair, mumbling things she couldn't quite hear. Money. Clinics. Discretion. Plans. All of it theoretical. None of it kind. She sat still, her silence loud. And inside her, something else was stirring now, something that wasn't fear. It was confusion, yes. Terror, of course. But also something that felt like grief. Not for the child. Not yet. But for who she used to be. For who they used to be. The secret had taken root. And neither of them would leave that room the same. Would you like me to continue with Act 9, 33:00, 36:00, titled The Pact, where they make a binding decision to hide everything and erase the consequences, no matter what it costs? Fear has a way of driving people into corners. And when cornered, people make choices, not wise ones, not moral ones, but desperate, trembling, midnight internet search choices. That's what Jake did. In the silent shadows of his room, when the house was still and only the dull hum of his phone filled the space, he searched. Typed words he never imagined would be on his screen. How to terminate a pregnancy at home. Where to get secret abortion. No questions asked. The results were a digital graveyard of anxiety. Websites that looked like they hadn't been updated in a decade. Chat rooms full of strangers offering homemade advice like witchcraft disguised as medicine. Papaya, aspirin, boiled herbs. Instructions hidden in comment threads. Every click sank him deeper, into a world of secrecy, of horror stories whispered behind usernames, of teenage girls who bled in silence because they had no one to turn to. And now, Emily was walking that same edge. Jake didn't tell her everything he saw. Just enough. Just what might work. Just what wouldn't cost more than the pocket change he'd saved over the months. Lunch money he never spent. Coins scavenged from the car, from drawers, from couch cushions. Emily added her share, birthday cash, forgotten notes crumpled in the corner of her school bag. They counted it together, not as teammates but as fugitives. The numbers were small, but their fear was vast. He found a name. A place. A woman who helps girls like you. She operated out of a room behind a barbershop 2 towns away. No signs. No appointments. Cash only. They would have to lie. About where they were going. About what they were doing. They would have to disappear for a day and come back like nothing happened. Like innocence could be reversed if only they played their part right. Emily said nothing for the longest time. Her face stayed blank when he showed her the plan. Not angry. Not crying. Just still. Like someone watching a dream they couldn't wake from. And when she finally nodded, it was not agreement, it was surrender. She couldn't tell her mother. Not because her mother would hurt her, but because her mother would break. Shatter into 1,000 pieces of disappointment and disbelief. Emily could already hear her voice. How could you? I trusted you. What kind of girl does this? And worst of all, the silence that would follow. So silence became safety. The plan took shape in fragments. They would fake a school project. Say they needed a trip to the city library. Emily would meet Jake at the back of the schoolyard where no teachers looked. They would take the bus. They would lie low. They would come back. Pretend nothing happened. Bury the memory like old bones in the dirt. But plans made in fear are never sturdy. Each passing day tightened the grip. Emily's body continued changing. Not visibly, but she felt it. Every step felt heavier. Every glance from her classmates made her chest tighten. Every hug from her mother felt like betrayal. She avoided mirrors. She stopped singing in the shower. She smiled only when people were looking. And Jake became distant and frantic all at once. His messages got shorter. His temper quicker. He started seeing everything as a risk. Every adult a threat. Every second a countdown. And yet, under all that urgency was a guilt neither could name. They weren't monsters. They were children. Children playing with matches in a room full of gasoline, too proud to ask for water. The night before their planned visit, Emily didn't sleep. Her mind was loud. What if it hurt? What if she bled too much? What if she never forgave herself? What if she did? She thought about names. About tiny fingers. About her future. About her past. She thought about Jake. About how they used to laugh not so long ago. About how the phone, the beautiful, stupid phone, had become their doorway into this mess. In another world, she might have said something. Might have told her mother. Might have cried on her shoulder and been wrapped in arms that said we'll get through this. But in this world, this fragile, broken, suburban world, they were alone. The money was ready. The lie was prepared. The fear was unbearable. And the clock was ticking. The back alley clinic was a place of darkness and quiet desperation. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, but there was no warmth in it, only an oppressive chill that clung to the walls like a memory they couldn't shake. The woman who performed the procedure had a calmness to her, a practiced indifference that made Emily's stomach churn. She had seen things in her life, and this was just another job, one more desperate face to erase from existence. She barely spoke to Emily, only gesturing for her to lie down, as if Emily was just another nameless body, another girl with no future. Emily tried to hold her breath, tried to keep the tears from welling up as the cold steel instruments were placed near her. Jake's presence was absent, though his shadow lingered behind her thoughts like a guilty conscience. He had promised to stay with her, to protect her. But now there was nothing but silence, and the procedure began. Pain erupted in waves, dull and sharp, moving through her body like an invasive force she couldn't escape. The procedure was supposed to be quick, safe, even, but there was no safety in this room. No protection, no compassion. Just cold hands, cold instruments, and a woman who muttered words Emily didn't understand, words that blurred in the fog of pain and fear. Emily closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the bed as her chest tightened, her heart hammering with the growing awareness that something wasn't right. She didn't know what went wrong, but the pain was too much now. It wasn't supposed to be this bad. When it was over, the woman handed Emily a cold towel and left her alone. She was to rest, she was told. It would be over soon. She could go home, she could pretend this had never happened. But as she sat up, a sharp, insistent throb in her stomach stopped her. The blood, dark, sticky, began to pool beneath her. Panic twisted in Emily's chest, but she couldn't move. Couldn't speak. The dizziness came first, followed by the nausea. She stumbled to her feet, her body refusing to obey her commands. She needed to get out of there. She needed Jake. But Jake was a distant figure now, an echo of a boy she once knew. She fumbled with her phone, calling him, her fingers trembling as the screen went dark before she could hit send. She slumped back against the wall, her eyes blurring with tears, the room spinning around her like a sickening carousel of regret. By the time she made it home, her body had begun to betray her in ways she couldn't ignore. Her movements were unsteady, and a burning sensation spread through her, deep inside, like fire that couldn't be extinguished. She could barely make it to the door before her legs gave way. It was Mrs. Miller who found her, just as Emily collapsed in a heap on the floor. Her mother had come back early, her hands still carrying the remnants of the day's work. The grocery bags in her hands dropped to the floor as she screamed, her voice a jagged, frantic sound that split the air. She rushed to Emily's side, kneeling beside her, but Emily was already too far gone. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged with the bluish hue of oxygen deprivation. Mrs. Miller could feel the heat radiating from her body, but it wasn't the fever she feared. It was the unmistakable sign of something far worse. Emily's eyes fluttered open for a moment, just enough for her to say something barely audible. "I'm sorry." And then she was gone again, slipping in and out of consciousness. Mrs. Miller wasted no time. She scooped her daughter up, her hands shaking as she cradled Emily close. Her heart pounded in her chest as she rushed toward the car, her mind screaming in terror. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity, the clock on the dashboard mocking her with each tick. When they arrived, Emily was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and erratic. The hospital staff moved quickly, ushering them into a sterile white room where the doctors worked to stabilize her. Time stretched into an agonizing blur of needles, machines, and voices. The doctors muttered phrases that made Mrs. Miller's blood run cold. Internal bleeding, complications life-threatening. The procedure had been far more dangerous than Emily had realized. The woman who performed it had been careless. The tools hadn't been sterilized properly, and a simple mistake had turned into a nightmare. Emily's body couldn't handle it. Her insides had torn, her blood spilling into places it shouldn't. For hours, Mrs. Miller waited, pacing the sterile hallways, her mind racing through every dark thought she could fathom. Was this her fault? Had she failed Emily in some unforgivable way? Every scream that escaped from her throat as she tried to wake her daughter was a reminder of just how alone she had been, how blind she had been to what her daughter had been hiding. When the doctors finally came to her, they gave her the news that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It was a miracle Emily had survived. The words cut through Mrs. Miller like a blade. Miracle. There was nothing miraculous about this. This wasn't fate, this was consequence. This was a chain of broken decisions that led to a place no mother should ever be. The doctors told her that if Emily had been any later, had waited just a little longer to get help, she would have died. Her body was too fragile to withstand the damage. The internal bleeding had almost taken her life, and the only reason she was still breathing was because Mrs. Miller had found her when she did. As Mrs. Miller sat in that sterile room, holding Emily's cold hand, her heart shattered into pieces. Her daughter, the girl she thought she knew, had slipped so far away from her, had fallen into a place so dark, she could hardly recognize her. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was a cry for help that had gone unnoticed for far too long. And as the night stretched on, Mrs. Miller sat vigil at her daughter's side, her mind racing with the unspoken questions. How could this have happened? What did she miss? What could she have done differently? But there were no answers. Only the silence of a hospital room that now felt like a tomb. It was supposed to be a moment of relief. Emily was out of danger, her life spared by a razor-thin margin. But as the hours passed and the sterile smell of the hospital room clung to the air, something darker began to unfurl in the shadows of this night. The truth, the one they had all been running from, was about to make itself known. Mrs. Miller sat at Emily's bedside, her eyes red from crying. The exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but it was the quiet despair in her chest that threatened to crush her. Emily had slipped into a deep sleep, her body worn out from the ordeal, but her mind remained trapped in a haze of confusion. She had been through something so traumatic, something that had permanently altered the course of her life, and her mother, Mrs. Miller, had missed it. The door opened, and a nurse entered with a soft knock. Mrs. Miller glanced up, weary, but the nurse didn't speak to her directly. Instead, she turned her attention to the phone on the small table next to Emily's bed. Mrs. Miller's eyes followed the nurse's gaze. It was Emily's phone, the same one she had been so protective of in recent weeks, the one that had once held nothing but games and school assignments, now a key to unraveling everything. The nurse hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder. Then she spoke, her voice low, almost apologetic. "We found some texts on Emily's phone. They're from Jake. The words hung in the air, suffocating the room with their weight. Mrs. Miller felt her pulse quicken, her stomach turning. She'd had suspicions, yes, but seeing the proof, knowing that her daughter's most private moments had been shared with Jake, knowing that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, was a sharp, piercing blow to her heart. The nurse continued. We thought it best to inform you. These texts, they're graphic, and they suggest more than just friendship. The room seemed to narrow as Mrs. Miller's mind raced, her heart pounding in her ears. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the realization that she had missed it all. How had she not seen it? How had she not noticed that the boundary between her daughter and Jake had crossed into something forbidden, something dangerous? How had she been so blind? As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Carter, Emily's best friend's mother, stepped in, her face weary from the long day but carrying the quiet burden of a mother's love. Mrs. Carter had been called too. Emily's crisis had shaken both households, and the weight of it all was too much for either mother to carry alone. But when Mrs. Carter saw the look on Mrs. Miller's face, she knew that something had happened. The tension in the room was thick, palpable, suffocating. The nurse took a step back, leaving the mothers alone, with the knowledge of what had been uncovered now hanging between them like an impenetrable wall. Mrs. Carter sat down beside Mrs. Miller, her hand resting gently on her friend's shoulder. There was no need for words at first. They both knew what was coming. The silence between them spoke volumes of the unspoken guilt that clung to them, a shared sorrow that neither could escape. And then Mrs. Miller spoke, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He texted her like that? How could she? How could they? Mrs. Carter let out a long breath, her face a mirror of the confusion and heartbreak she felt. I never imagined, she trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. What could she say? What words could explain how two children, two friends, could fall into something so dark, so destructive? Emily and Jake had always been close, like siblings, but this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't something that could be explained away. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating, like a heavy fog rolling in from the sea, drowning everything in its path. Mrs. Carter took another breath, and then she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of it all. How did we not see this coming? The words were like a slap to both of them. How did we not see this coming? It was the question that would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. How had they not seen the signs? How had they allowed their children to slip away from them, inch by inch, until it was too late to turn back? The texts between Jake and Emily had been the proof, the hard evidence that what had happened between them wasn't just a moment of weakness or a lapse in judgment. It was a result of something much deeper, something far more insidious, a breaking of trust, a crossing of boundaries, a violation of everything they had once held dear. Mrs. Miller couldn't stop the tears that welled up in her eyes, nor could she stop the torrent of emotions that surged within her. She had failed her daughter. She had been so consumed by her own struggles, her own worries, that she hadn't noticed Emily's cries for help, hadn't seen the signs of her pain, her fear, her confusion. And now there was no going back. The damage had been done. The truth had been revealed. Mrs. Carter stood up, wiping a tear from her cheek, her face full of sorrow. She had no answers, no comfort to offer her friend. She could only stand there, sharing the silence, the brokenness, the deep, aching regret that swirled between them like a storm. The phone, their secret, was no longer hidden. There would be no more pretending. No more quiet, stolen moments in the dark. The secret was out, and with it came the weight of everything that had been left unsaid, everything that had been ignored. The two mothers, united in their heartbreak, stood there together, facing the mess they had both failed to prevent. Their children were no longer innocent. Their trust had been shattered, and now they had to figure out how to rebuild it, if that was even possible. But for now, all they could do was sit in the silence, staring at the screen that had revealed their worst fears, wondering how they had missed the signs, how they had failed to see the truth. The weeks that followed were shrouded in an uneasy silence, a quiet chaos that neither of the families could escape. The lives they had once known, comfortable in their routines and predictable in their habits, now lay shattered at their feet, a million sharp pieces too scattered to be easily put together. Emily and Jake, two children who had once been inseparable, found themselves bound together by a web of guilt, fear, and unspoken trauma, a bond now defined by something far darker than friendship. The counseling sessions were mandatory, not just for the children but for both mothers as well. Therapy, they were told, would help them heal. But it wasn't the kind of healing that came quickly, nor did it offer the comfort they desperately needed. It was raw, painful work, digging into wounds they hadn't known existed, peeling back layers of hurt and confusion that had festered beneath the surface for years. Jake's sessions were difficult, and his walls remained high, stubbornly unyielding. He resented the idea of therapy, resented that his actions were now seen as the root of everything that had gone wrong. In his eyes, his mother had failed him long before this mess had started, and now, she expected him to open up to a stranger, to reveal the secrets that had driven him to this point. It felt like a betrayal all over again, another adult pushing him to speak, to admit things he wasn't ready to face. He was angry, lost in his confusion, and unwilling to acknowledge the shame that gnawed at him every day. But bit by bit, even Jake's walls began to crack. Emily, on the other hand, carried her pain in silence, the weight of her trauma etched deep in her eyes. The emotional scars she carried wouldn't show on the surface, but they shaped every move she made, every word she spoke. She was quieter now, withdrawn. The innocence that had once defined her had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow version of the girl she had been. She spoke little about what had happened between her and Jake, but her actions spoke volumes. She was distant, afraid to get close to anyone, including her own mother. The connection they had once shared was now tainted, fractured by the secrets that neither could undo. As for Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Miller, they were finally beginning to understand just how far removed they had been from their children's lives. They had been too busy, too distracted by their own struggles, to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. The guilt they now carried was like an anchor, holding them in place, preventing them from moving forward with any real sense of resolution. They had failed as mothers, they both knew that. But what could they do now? The damage had been done, the trust shattered. All they could do was try to be present, try to heal the wounds that time couldn't undo. The therapy sessions became a regular part of their lives, but the recovery was slow. It was no longer about fixing what was broken. It was about learning to live with the aftermath, to rebuild from the rubble. Emily and Jake were forced to confront the things they had tried to bury, and the process was neither neat nor clean. There were days when the pain felt unbearable, when the guilt weighed them down so heavily that it seemed impossible to move forward. But there were also moments, rare, fleeting moments, when they could look at each other without the weight of their shared history looming over them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Miller began to make more of an effort to be present, not just in their children's lives, but in each other's as well. They were no longer content to live in the shadows of their own distractions. They started to have honest conversations about their failures, about the things they had ignored for so long, and about the importance of being there for their children, even when it was hard, even when it meant facing uncomfortable truths. For Emily, it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about survival. She had to learn how to live with the scars of what had happened, how to move forward despite the darkness that seemed to hover just out of reach. Her childhood was gone, forever lost to the choices she and Jake had made, but she still had a future that, for the first time, seemed uncertain and fragile. And then there was Jake. He would never forget the way his world had unraveled, the way his life had gone from simple to complicated in the blink of an eye. He had made mistakes, grave ones, and no matter how much he wanted to erase them, he couldn't. But therapy gave him a place to begin to make sense of it all, to understand the roots of his actions. It didn't make the pain go away, but it allowed him to breathe a little easier with each session, a little less weighed down by the secrets he had once kept hidden. As for Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Miller, they knew that their children would never be the same again. But they also knew that they weren't the same either. They were mothers who had been forced to face the consequences of their neglect, mothers who had seen firsthand the toll that silence could take on a child's soul. They couldn't go back in time and fix everything, but they could move forward together. Neglect isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silence that ruins everything. It's the absence of the small, everyday moments, the hugs, the questions, the simple act of being present, that leaves a void. And in that silence, the darkness creeps in, unnoticed, until it's too late.